Welcome to another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Today's episode is a rewind from our interview with Justin Mayers, co-author of Traction, a startup guide to getting customers. In this interview, Justin goes into how important it is for startups to gain adoption and get real customers. Traction is really about Justin's journey as an entrepreneur and everything he's learned. Let's get started. Welcome to Inside Outside Innovation. This is the podcast that brings you the latest insights from people who know the most about building lean businesses, innovating within corporations, and disrupting entire industries with passion and precision. Learn more at insideoutside.io or econic.co. Let's get started.
So I guess to start off, prior to writing Traction, you spent some time in the trenches as a startup founder yourself. So can you tell our audience a little bit of kind of a brief history of your startup adventures before writing the book?
So let's see. So I started my first company when I was in college. I was a sophomore in college, and like I think many students coming in, they go to college for the first time living with someone. I had like an awful roommate experience, and so my first company was basically started what I called Roommate Fit, which was like an eHarmony for roommates. So we did like personality-based roommate matching. So we got some traction, like we got some revenue. We matched like 8,000 students, went through an accelerator there. But ultimately, like selling to universities is possibly the worst thing ever, and I will never do it again. Like it's painful. So that didn't really work. But and then after that, I co-founded a company called CloudFab, which was a 3D printing company. So we built like the first API for 3D printing. This was way back in the earlier days before 3D printing was like hot. And personally, I think we were a little too early, but it was a really cool experience that ended up getting acquired for like a small sum. And then after that, I joined a company called Exceptional Cloud Services, where we built like software tools for software developers. And we got acquired by Rackspace for 8 figures in like 2013, in mid-2013. So, and then wrote Traction.
Very cool.
Came out with Traction a couple months after.
So, and you co-wrote this with Gabriel Weinberg of DuckDuckGo. How did you guys meet, and how did you get connected about writing this book?
Yeah, so, Traction was something that I had always struggled with, always had a lot of questions around, wanted to become a good marketer, learn more about it. And Gabriel had been working on some of the interviews like since 2009, basically. So we met because we were both, my family's based in Philly, and he's a Philly-based entrepreneur. And so we just met and kind of like pitched him on doing this together and getting it out there. And that's what we did. And it's like the reception has been so awesome, which has been cool.
So why did you decide to kind of write a book specifically about traction? What was the thing that kind of attracted you to that subject matter?
Yeah, honestly, the main thing was I had struggled. Like, this was the thing that I had struggled with. Like, I thought that I read the Lean Startup, I read the 4 Steps of the Epiphany, I read all of that stuff, and yet when it was, after going through this and like with Roommate Fit especially, like I thought I had built something people wanted. I thought I went through the process. I thought I did everything correctly, but unfortunately, like we ended up failing, and the main reason was because we couldn't get traction. And so for me, I thought that was like the main problem that I was struggling with. And after talking to just tons of other entrepreneurs, like that's a huge problem in almost every business.
Yeah, without a doubt.
That's the book. We wanted to basically write the lean startup for what you do once you have an MVP or a product that you think is working.
Yeah, and what I really love about the book is how tactical the advice and examples are. You kind of outline the 19 different areas of traction and that. How did you go about researching the book?
Oh man, it took forever. Like we interviewed more than 40 entrepreneurs who had been successful or gotten traction through each of the different 19 channels that we mentioned in the book. But as we did that, we read like hundreds of blog posts. We talked to people about, like experts in a channel like SEO. Like, what do you do? If you were us, what would you include? What do you think, what articles do you think are worth including, or what should we do? So we just got a ton of really expert feedback from people who have just been crushing like these different marketing channels. So we use them really to inform what we included in the book. And like we wanted most of all to just make it really tactical because, honestly, I have a huge issue with business books that I think are just like awful and not tactical and just kind of a waste of space and like super fluffy. And so we wanted to do the opposite of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously Lean Startup, and there's other books out there that are kind of more high level on that. How do you think Traction applies to the overall Lean Startup framework, and where does it apply?
I think it works really well with Lean Startup. Like we actually did an interview with Eric Ries where we talked about this, but basically like Lean Startup is how do I build a product and validate certain features with different customers. It's like you have this idea or you have a product. How do you figure out what features to build next, and how do you validate that those features are what customers actually want? Like that is the entire purpose of Lean Startup, and it does it really, really well. Nowhere in that, however, does it say anything like, here is how you actually get your first 100 customers, or here's how you go from 100 customers to 1,000. And so we just saw a lot of entrepreneurs were like lost in that space where they use Lean Startup and they applied this framework and they validated a product and they did a bunch of good stuff. And then once they had 10 customers, they were like, where do we go from here? And there was no similar methodology to figure that out.
Sorry, why do you think folks struggle, and why did kind of you struggle personally with finding traction? Why do you think it's such a common problem?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things. Like there are, let's see, I would say there's a couple. So one thing that's big is that if you look at Growth Hackers or Hacker News or whatever, there are tons and tons of different traction channels and marketing hacks and growth hacks that people talk about all the time. And so unlike building a product where it's like, hey, I'm gonna focus on this like feature, we're gonna fix this bug, and my customers told me that they want it, so like I can go build that and it'll be a net win for the company. Marketing is kind of like you're taking more of a shot in the dark and you're like, man, I hope this marketing channel will work, And so we saw a lot of people would like read online like how this business used content marketing to get 100,000 visitors a month. And then they would write 3 blog posts, find that it wasn't that easy or it didn't work for them. And then they would start testing some other like Facebook ads hack that they saw, online or whatever. And so after all these different things, we saw that basically this is what people struggled with, and like they didn't really have a systematic way to approach the problem of getting traction for their business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So in the book, you talk a lot about, you kind of put it into a framework. You call it the bullseye framework of how startup founders can kind of tackle this idea of traction and figure out which particular channels are going to be most effective. Can you walk our audience through the bullseye framework a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So the basic idea behind the bullseye framework is like you look at each of the 19 different traction channels you could potentially use to acquire customers. And then you figure out, through a process of brainstorming, interviewing people, looking at what other companies who've tried to reach your same target customers have done well. And you say like, okay, here are some channels that I think make sense for a business. You run small tests in those channels. Like if you think Facebook ads might work, you spend $500 or $1,000 on Facebook ads and then double down on what works. So you find Facebook ads work and you up your budget to like 5K or 10K a month, until you tap out that channel, and then you kind of go through the process again.
Very interesting. So which of the 19 areas do you think startups either overuse or conversely don't take advantage of enough? Or are there particular channels that work better?
That's a really hard question. I mean, just because it's so dependent on the type of company you are. Like if you're selling, $1 million software to Fortune 500 companies or something, like bank security software or whatever, that's a very, very different type of business than if you're trying to get 100,000 downloads on your mobile app. And so it really is dependent on the business, on what channels are available to them, and on just where their customers hang out.
So in your research in that, have you found that startups use typically try one particular channel over the others, and then again either find traction or not? Or how systematic have you seen folks either using what you've put out in the book to actually gain traction?
Yeah, so we've seen people use our stuff really systematically, which is really cool. Like, to answer your first question, um, I see a lot of startups focusing on things that even if they were to work somehow, their business wouldn't change. Like I've seen companies that have maybe 10,000 customers or whatever, and they're like, cool, we're going to start doing podcast interviews. And, it's like there's like 4 podcasts in their niche. They have less than, I don't know, 5,000 listeners or something. Like this is especially prevalent with some developer tools companies I've seen. But it's like, guys, even if you got a 10% conversion rate on everyone in that marketing channel, like it wouldn't make that much of a difference to your business, And so you see that a lot where the same thing happens where someone is like, oh, we have, I don't know, however many customers, we're going to try writing like blog posts, or we're going to try and do a bunch of stuff with AdWords in a really niche category that gets only a couple thousand searches a month. Like, even if it works, it's just not worth doing,
Mm-hmm. So who do you see in the market that's kind of getting it right and doing a good job at kind of systematically working through their channels?
Oh man, I mean, there's so many companies. Like my co-author, Gabriel, his company is doing an incredible job. Like if you go to duckduckgo.com/traffic, his search engine, their traffic is just like hitting the classic hockey stick growth curve. So I mean, that company is doing incredibly well. Zenefits has they tested their way to figuring out that outbound email, like doing outreach to different companies that fit their potential customer base, works really, really well for them. And so they're scaling that incredibly. Like they're hiring hundreds of SDRs. They're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month with different scraping companies. They're like testing all these email scripts to really scale that channel. So I'd say like those are 2 companies that are doing a really, really good jobs of applying this framework and like iterating and doubling down.
Very interesting. In the 19 channels, you have a pretty wide variety of ways to reach an audience. Everything from trade shows to speaking engagements to content marketing, blogging, and things like that. What are some of the things that are there particular channels that work better if you're like B2B versus B2C?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one very obvious one is like sales, like doing outbound sales or getting on the phone with every customer. That just doesn't make sense if you're trying to do a consumer focused site. If you're trying to get app downloads, like maybe that's an okay strategy at first to get your first like 100 or 1,000 downloads, but it just doesn't make sense over the long term. So that's like a very clear and easy one.
Exactly. Great. And then what are some of the tactics that you use to get book traction on your book?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we wrote a really big blog post about this. It was like traction by the numbers. We wrote it about 2 months after it came out, but it was like, here are the different channels that we use to sell roughly 10,000 copies or more than 10,000 copies in just like 2 months. And so the big things there were podcast interviews actually were huge for us. Like I didn't realize how big of a channel that would be, but it was. Then another thing was we did some guest posts and like co-email marketing with some people who have larger lists. But the biggest one by far for us was actually just hitting up our email list. Like we have a very responsive email list, and we had almost 10,000 people that were really supportive and like really like they bought our book almost immediately after we launched.
And that was a list that you'd curated before through other.
Yeah, so we'd spent about a year or 2 creating that. So we just had, a landing page, and like we had people signing up and got email addresses that way.
Very cool. Very cool. So you kind of had a pre-built audience so that you knew when you launched the book, you'd actually be able to get traction.
Yeah, exactly. But it was so worth it because, we launched the book, and like within an hour or two of sending out that email, we were in like the top 50 of Amazon.
Well, that's the end of another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Thanks so much for listening, and we really appreciate Justin for coming on the show. If you have some thoughts on how we can make the show better to fit your needs, send us a note at the IO podcast or insideoutside.io. Until next time, go build something big.